I'm going to present basically a book that I've written a few years ago. There's a few in the room who probably are familiar with my story already because it's partially based on a PhD thesis that I once wrote in Leuven, and Leuven has one big export product to the Netherlands, which is political philosophers. So they end up everywhere, including here. Yes, my book and my story for today starts with this picture, which is a picture that I took at the Occupy camp at Occupy London Stock Exchange. This was at the steps of the St. Paul's Cathedral in London. And I was just there. I was living in the UK at the time, and I was just there to kind of observe and walking around. And at some point, I happened to notice this street sign, which, as you can see, is designed as a street sign from the city of Westminster. Now, St. Paul's Cathedral is technically not in the city of Westminster, so that's a bit of a bummer, but I guess the point that the person who made this, or persons who made this sign tried to convey, of course, is that somehow Tahrir Square is here. Somehow what happened in Tahrir Square is also happening here, or this is some kind of reincarnation of that event some months ago. And that's, of course, a reference to this. The occupied Tahrir Square in central Cairo earlier that year in January 2011, which was an iconic occupation and which eventually played a big role in forcing President Mubarak to resign. And this form of the Occupy camp, as you can see, was copied in the following years by many other protest camps across the world, including Occupy. This is the one where I took the picture, but also in many other places. The Gezi Park uprising, of course, in 2013. What was it called again? Nuit debout movement in Paris, who didn't occupy it permanently. And for instance, most recently, the autonomous zone in Seattle. And another Tahrir Square, which got a lot less attention in the press here. But there was a last occupation like this in Tahrir Square in Baghdad in 2020. Now, you could also say that to some degree, of course, this form of the protest camp has been adopted by many protest movements since, including, of course, the encampments on various universities in solidarity with Palestine. But I think they have a slightly different form of organization. So I'm not sure if there are some comparisons that one could make, but I don't think it's quite an example of the same phenomenon. What is this phenomenon? Well, what all these squares had in common with these squares occupations is that they didn't have a clear leadership structure. They were not affiliated to any political party. They didn't have a visible leader or figurehead. It is argued that they didn't have demands, that they never made demands, but that's not quite true. I think in most of these cases, these square occupations did make demands, but it is true that they didn't have a clear political agenda that could easily be implemented in practice. So if they made demands, these were more like long-term demands that you see more often in radical protest movements. But more importantly, what they all did was occupy public space and do something with it. Within the confined space of an occupied square, of an occupied street, they gave rise to new forms of organization and cohabitation. And as I was trying to make sense of the Occupy movement in 2011, and for instance, the so-called Arab Spring that preceded it, it struck me that there was a concept that I knew from anarchist theory, but that was quite obscure at the time, that was suddenly being used, especially in the context of Occupy Wall Street. And that's not coincidental, of course, because one of the founders, arguably, of Occupy Wall Street was an anarchist theorist who used this concept before, which was the late David Graeber. Graeber was interviewed on his role in Occupy Wall Street, where he was quite modest. He tried not to present himself as a leader of the movement. He was quite absent also because he didn't want it to become the David Graeber movement. But he gave a few interviews about what inspired this movement. And one of them is by Ezra Klein in the Washington Post, where he is confronted with this critique that the movement did not have a clear list of demands or no clearly identifiable leadership. And he's asked, what is this about? And David Graeber gives a very elaborate answer, but he says, it's prefigurative, so to speak. You're creating a vision of the sort of society that you want to have in a miniature form. So what was this movement about? It was about prefiguring an alternative, prefiguring something else that may lie in the future, but that could at least be temporarily and experimentally realized in the present. This concept of prefiguration actually has a much longer history. It's originally a theological concept, and it's used in the tradition of biblical exegesis to explain relations, possible relations between events and persons in the Old Testament and events and persons in the New Testament. So, for instance, Noah's Ark is a prefiguration of the church. The sacrifice of Isaac is a prefiguration of the sacrifice of Christ, etc. That's how, in medieval times, biblical scholars would use this concept. But it re-emerges. I'm not sure if it re-emerges. I've never been able to clearly establish a connection between the theological use and the more activist use. So I'm not sure if it re-emerges, but it emerges in the 1970s in literature on protest movements and social movements, especially the neo-left, but also anarchist movements. And after that, it was used most predominantly in anarchist literature to describe the practices of anarchist movements. Basically, the idea of prefiguration is that activists, social movements, try to embody or already realize their ultimate aims, their long-term objectives within their everyday practices, and to act consistently with the ultimate ends that they have. So it's kind of, you could say, a way to challenge the divisions often made, the distinctions often made between the present and the future, but also between the means of radical politics or revolutionary politics and its ultimate objectives. That's the term prefiguration, but of course the term was immediately used also in reference to much older practices and to similar ideas that have existed in radical theory, at least from the mid-19th century. And again, the most dominant one here is anarchism. Actually, arguably, one could say that anarchism starts with this idea of prefiguration, even though in the late 19th century anarchists lacked the term. But one may argue that anarchism in its historical origin revolves around this idea, because anarchism as a distinct radical tradition emerges from debates with other communist movements. So anarchism was originally a tendency within the European communist workers movement, and anarchism as a distinct tradition kind of results from a clash that at some point occurred. Some would argue it was exactly in 1872 between Marx and Bakunin, his anarchist counterpart in the First International. And when Bakunin and his followers were being expelled from the First International, that's the, according to some, that's the origin of anarchism as a separate tradition. Now, this Bakunin was an interesting figure. I won't say much about him, but he was a Russian of noble descent. And he had a big following, especially in the less industrialized parts of Europe. So especially in Italy and Spain, and southern France, but also in Switzerland. And he was part of a federation within that international that was called the Jura Federation. And that indeed argued, like Bakunin, that revolutionary change cannot be established by means that are incompatible with the aim of the change itself. And so the point of disagreement with Marx, one of the points of disagreement, was precisely about the question to what extent the First International as an international organization of revolutionaries should in some way resemble the ultimate aim of this movement. And this led the Jura Federation to endorse what they called the embryo thesis. They said the international, as the embryo of the human society of the future, is required in the here and now to faithfully mirror our principles of freedom and federation and shun any principle leaning towards authority and dictatorship. So the idea was that the international should kind of resemble the ultimate aim. For Marx, as many of you may know, He had a very different idea about this. He, especially at the time, although he had revised many of his ideas on this, but he thought that state power should be appropriated and reformed so as to serve as a revolutionary tool for the working classes. So for him, there was a use to some form of state apparatuses, specifically proletarian state apparatuses, but there was some use for forms of force that may not outlive the revolution in the long term. So the term prefiguration is often used to refer to this original debate. It's also used in reference to another idea by the syndicalist movement, which are kind of which inherited a lot of the insights of this anarchist movement, especially the international workers of the world, the IWW, a big international labor union, who had as one of its famous slogans that it sought to establish or build the new society within the shell of the old. So the idea was that the workers' union would, in many ways, not only serve as a revolutionary instrument to topple state power, but to topple the state, but also to eventually replace it with something else. And so one of the tasks next to mobilizing for revolutionary change or mobilizing for a general strike would be to already build the kind of structures that could eventually replace the state. This idea of building the new society in the shell of the old is very often, until today, used as an equivalent of this term prefiguration, and it may not surprise us that the aforementioned David Graeber also was a member of the IWW, which still exists today. Now, the term also has different uses and meanings. It was taken up in 1970s literature on the New Left, where it had a slightly different connotation. There it was often used in reference to the self-liberatory practices of activists within their living communities or within their activist movements. So the idea basically that one not only has to seek revolutionary change, but also be the change that they want to see. And so we're talking much more about the prefiguration of alternative social relations rather than political institutions. And it was used within the alter-globalist movement, where again it got a slightly different meaning, because then it was often used specifically to refer to more substantive ideas of democratic decision-making and organization. And the ultimate example in most of this literature is the General Assembly. The idea that, so we're speaking here, for instance, of the context of big protest camps that would often emerge at places where the heads of state of the G7 or the G8 would come together. There would be a big protest against it with thousands of people, and they would use decision-making techniques, for instance, that were radical democratic and horizontal. And prefiguration was often used in reference to these kind of techniques. But what is striking here is that really prefiguration is increasingly used as a more substantive idea of what a democratic society should look like. So the distinction between form and substance kind of disappears here completely. Now we find ourselves in a different context, in the context of the square occupation movement, such as Occupy Wall Street. And the question and the term prefiguration is used again, is digged up again by some radical theorists. We can also see that since 2011, the term has gained much more attention and has been used both by activists and by scholars much more frequently and theorized much more. But it was in this context that the concept kind of gained popularity. But this also gives rise to a number of tensions, because as we've seen already, the term prefiguration actually refers to many different practices and different ideas and has been employed in very different contexts. And so some of the tensions that arguably emerge here in debates on prefiguration is, for instance, whether prefiguration should be seen as a revolutionary strategy, as it clearly was in its original use in reference to anarchist movements, or much more as an anti-strategic principle, as it is used much more often, for instance, in reference to New Left literature, where the prefiguration of alternative social relations is presented precisely as a non-strategic element and as kind of the opposite of strategic planning and goal-oriented radical politics. Another question is, does prefiguration merely refer to the, let's say, the formal means-end relation in radical politics, or does it, perhaps in consequence, also have a slightly more substantive core? And this is important because there's also literature that, for instance, applies this concept in the context of white supremacist movements. So the question is prefiguration something that a variety of different movements can do, or is there something about how one seeks to mediate means and ends that arguably also implies that there is let's say, a more substantive aspect to it, that prefiguration typically caters to a more specific notion of democracy. And finally, the question, of course, is, does it refer to the direct or participatory practices that were used by many of the aforementioned movements, especially the alto-globalist movement, but also Occupy, who inherited a lot of these techniques from the alto-globalist movements? Or is there also, let's say, a more symbolically representative element to prefiguration? I'll get back to that question specifically, because I think there is. So I think it is often used as a term that kind of excludes any form of political representation, and I don't think that's necessarily correct. So my thesis in the book is basically that we need a different theory of prefiguration that is not primarily anarchist, although I like anarchism. That's not the point. I don't necessarily want to criticize the tradition or its value, but I think more contemporary radical democratic theory can actually be helpful to kind of reconceptualize prefiguration and what it might mean in the context of more large-scale movements today. There's also a more substantive reason why I'm critical of the anarchist origin of the concept. I won't go into this in much detail given the time, but that is because I think that nowadays, if we look at protest movements where this concept of prefiguration is used, or in reference to which this concept is used, what you see is we're often speaking of the kind of the political forms that take shape, the forms of decision making, the forms of organization that take shape, for instance, within an occupied space, and that it's very much experimenting with the political form, with creating new public spheres in which the political can be performed. Whereas if we look at some of the original uses of the term, it also has, especially in more contemporary anarchist theory, it has a more social implication. So it's much more used in terms of how one prefigures a radically different society within one's forms of cohabitation. I think a neat illustration of that is the cover of another book that was published on the topic by Paul Raakstad and Sofa Gradin, a great book. But I think the cover illustration kind of neatly suggests what I meant. Like this is not what I would think is most relevant about prefiguration today. What's more relevant is how alternative political procedures and institutions and forms of organization are established, and how they serve to kind of reinstitutionalize our understanding of society. And that is a radical democratic idea in the sense that I try to rethink this concept of prefiguration in the context of a tradition influenced by theorists like Laclau, for instance, who will argue that our shared understanding of society is always informed by the concrete political institutions that are in place in this society, rather than the other way around. Another reason to kind of rethink this concept is that what you see in a lot of the literature on recent mass mobilizations, on these square occupation movements, for example, is that more authors have tried to kind of mediate between two radically different readings of radical change, but also radically different readings of these movements. And arguably they both apply to some degree. So many of these movements were on the one hand often read as, let's say, autonomous movements, as expressions of the wish to establish direct democracy, participatory or horizontally organized participatory democracy, Indeed, ideas that are particularly prominent in anarchist tendencies, but also, for instance, in the work of Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, which I guess some of you know. But at the same time, what we also see in practice is that significant parts of these movements were actually much more keen on presenting themselves as representatives of something or someone, and on making representative claims. Now, prefiguration is often in this literature, for instance, by Cristina Flecha-Fominaya, or by Paulo Gelbaudo, or by Rodrigo Nunes. Prefiguration is often presented as one side of this division. So, let's say the tension between the wish to experiment with direct democracy on the one hand, and the need to engage with some forms of representative claim making on the other. And my claim is actually that if we want to understand what is prefigurative about these movements, prefiguration is not on one side of this division, but is precisely in between. Because prefiguration cannot be conceptualized, I argue, without taking into account at least some concept of representation. I will get back to that. And so that leads me to, well, basically the central claim of, the central methodology of, if you like, of the book. I'm trying to combine, to bring together two very different authors who may not have liked each other, and their followers very often may not. But I nevertheless try to bring them together in the context of this concept, because I think they both have something to contribute to it, which is on the one hand Hannah Arendt, a name that I suppose is very familiar here, and who has been read, of course, in very different ways, but I tend to read her, like many others, as a radical democratic author, who I think presents a non-instrumentalist or experiential reading of political action that is particularly helpful to understand what is at stake for people involved in these kind of movements. And on the other hand, Ernesto Laclau, a theorist of left-wing populism, who has written a lot on political representation and its inevitability in radical politics. Now, Laclau himself never applied his theory to these kind of movements. In fact, he was quite critical of these movements. I once got a chance, just before he died, to discuss it with him, and he found it a bit ridiculous that his theory would also be, may also be applicable to Occupy Wall Street or the 50N movement in Spain. But I think it is. So I think we can, by taking these two very different authors together, I hope to end up with let's say, a radical democratic understanding of prefiguration that does justice to the fact that indeed, as often is the case in social movements, there are different tendencies who influence a movement. And a social movement is a product of different ideas, of different repertoires, of different currents and movements and tendencies that together constitute this movement and make it what it is. Even though there may be significant tensions between them. Social movements are never theoretically or politically consistent, I think, but always these kind of contingent combinations. The non-instrumentalist reading of prefiguration, I think, has become important, was already important then, but has become more important in recent years. There have been moments where I thought, what's the point of publishing a book on Occupy Wall Street and these kind of movements so many years after, when there has been so much already. But fortunately, last year there was also another book by Vincent Bevins, perhaps some of you read it, which arguably presents quite the opposite perspective on these movements as what I defend in my book, which is arguably a rather instrumentalist one. And I think this book is, it also conveys how a way of thinking that has always been more widespread, and a way of criticizing these movements that was arguably already in place in 2011 and the following years, namely the view that argues that this movement doesn't have a clear end or doesn't have a clear goal, doesn't pursue a clear strategy, and therefore is doomed to failure. Now, that's not what Bevins argued. He has the benefit of hindsight, but he does say this was it. He analyzes various movements all across the world, and he argues how he seeks to understand how these various movements and mass mobilizations that we've seen in the past 15 years gave rise to so much democratic enthusiasm and initiatives, and yet at the same time did not, in his account, did not lead to anything. So his question is basically, what happens if we try to write the story of the world in this decade, guided by the puzzling question, how is it possible that so many mass protests apparently led to the opposite of what they asked for? And although that may be true, I would agree that in many cases the immediate outcomes of many of these movements may have been very different from what they asked for, and in the longer term this difference becomes clearer. In Egypt there is a new dictatorship has been established. In the US, Trump won the election twice since, of course, we had Bolsonaro, and there's many other examples of where political discourse and institutions took a very different turn. So you may indeed argue that they led to something else than what they asked for. Yet at the same time, what it also implies is that we should read these movements in instrumental terms as a means that leads to some kind of predefined end. And I don't think that corresponds with how many people involved in these movements experienced it themselves at the time. They may have similar critique as Bevins now, but I don't think it does justice to the kind of prefigurative experience at the time. And so the question is, how can we use prefiguration to kind of rethink what that relation between means and ends is in radical politics? And of course, prefiguration, as I argued before, often is defined in terms of means and ends, and kind of is often defined as an attempt to kind of challenge or revise the relation between means and ends, or even the distinction, the category of means and ends in general. Classical anarchists, although they lack the term prefiguration, would often argue that there needs to be a high measure of consistency between revolutionary means and ends. But the question is, of course, what that means for contemporary movements if there is a lot of discussions about these ends, or if actually movements seem to endorse the fact that they may not have a clear idea of what these ultimate ends are. And I think that is the case with many of these square occupation movements. The debate about what the ends of radical politics should be was very much at stake in many of these movements. Some Marxist scholars have redefined prefiguration as a rehearsal of ultimate ends. So they say, indeed, that the exact details of the ultimate ends may not be known, but at least we can see it as a rehearsal that eventually should lead to a more elaborate knowledge of what these ends may entail. The problem is, I think this is still overlooking the experiential character of prefiguration. So if you want to stay with musical terms, I would say prefiguration is more like a jam session than a rehearsal. There's more of an element of direct experimentation there, rather than trying to figure out how to establish some kind of ultimate objective, which, as a band member, I think is very much elementary to rehearsing. Post-anarchists, finally, which is also a tradition, post-anarchists finally also use the term prefiguration, but to argue that radical activists may serve a plurality may pursue a plurality of different ends, or tailor. The question is how applicable this is in radical democratic movements. One easily ends up drawing very liberal conclusions, I would say, about how individuals within the context of a movement set their own individual ends. Now, what is interesting about Arendt in this particular case, and those of you familiar with her work may recognize this, what's particularly interesting about Arendt, I think, is that she challenges the very idea that politics is about means and ends. And she does that, I won't get into that in detail now, but she does that by drawing a famous conceptual distinction between different forms of engagement with the world, which is action, which is labor, work, and action or political action, where the latter is defined by Arendt as, in non-instrumentalist terms, as an attempt to make a new beginning, but without knowing where one will eventually end up, or without even wanting to know where one eventually will end up. And she kind of, she in that sense, draws a contrast with, especially with work as an attitude, which is usually instrumentalist and where one has a predefined end, a vision of the ultimate objective, a model, or perhaps even a blueprint of what the eventual end may be, and then sees the process itself as its implementation. So action for Arendt is precisely that kind of open-ended attempt to make a new beginning, but without necessarily having a defined idea of where this will lead to. And as a matter of fact, this is very much something that is inheres in the political process itself. And therefore she concludes it is political action that entails an experience of freedom, unlike all these other forms of engagement. Precisely because these ends are not given, precisely because these ends are considered to be open or unknown, engagement in a public space or engagement in political action entails a true experience of freedom as far as she's concerned. And so what this experience, what this analysis of political action does is precisely grasp that experiential understanding of politics as something where there is no end in the double sense of the term, there is no end in the sense of an objective, but also no end in the sense of a temporal moment at which political action will come to its end. I will skip this a bit because of time, but just very briefly, that of course gives rise to the question how many of these movements try to do that and try to present themselves, see themselves as open-ended. And I think one of the reasons that many of these movements eventually gave rise to some kind of council system that was supposed to be durable and that was supposed to outlive the moment of protest or revolution itself is precisely an indication. So they tried to establish the kind of institutions that would allow them to continue with their prefigurative experiment even after their square occupations had come to an end or their squares had been evicted. And this is precisely also what Arendt describes as something that happens in revolutionary movements. The council is an institutional form that magically almost, because there's no necessary connection or explanation as far as she's concerned, but the council is a form that re-emerges in grand revolutionary moments precisely as an attempt to keep this open-ended character of the revolutionary moment open, but at the same time give some kind of durable character to it. I'll skip this for now. Second question, I said there's also a representative side to it, is about representation and the question how or to what extent these mass mobilizations, these prefigurative movements represent something. Especially in the first years after the emergence of movements like Occupy, most scholars who try to make sense of it present them as radically anti-representative movements, as movements that questioned the very idea of representation itself. And two very vocal authors in this debate are Marina Citrin and Dario Azzolini, who say that even the slogans of these movements, such as "they don't represent us," were not phrased as rejections of specific political representatives, but as expressions of a general rejection of the logic of representation. A more recent book, which has also been translated to English recently, that kind of theorizes this idea of presentist democracy as a non-representative democracy, has been written by Isabelle Lorrain. So this was quite a dominant analysis at the time, I'd say. But the problem is that, and those who were in Leuven know this because this was one of the topics we all used to work on at the time. Representation actually has a quite complex use as a term. And it's quite telling and interesting that the term representation itself only has there's only one concept of representation in English, as there is, for instance, in French, whereas in many other languages we make distinctions between at least two concepts of representation, namely on the one hand the idea of representation as a mandated acting for or on behalf of someone. The typical example is that of the lawyer or the politician who has received a formal mandate to stand in on someone else's behalf and make decisions on their behalf. which we in Dutch would call vertegenwoordiging, or which Vertretung in German. But there's also another concept which is much more symbolic, which is about how, for instance, indeed a politician, but also a painting can stand for something, can embody something, can convey that they are like something, which is what we would call representatie in Dutch, or Darstellung in German. And it's quite telling that these concepts are not clearly distinguished in many languages, and that a lot of the critique of representation was implicitly about both, whereas one may argue that indeed some of the aforementioned movement, not all of them, were critical of the idea of representation as acting for someone else. But it is one may argue that it's impossible to make sense of what these movements did and to make sense of their prefigurative experiments without having a concept of representation as Darstellung or representatie, representation as standing for something. And not in the last place, a slogan popularized by Occupy Wall Street, "We are the 99%, is a strong representative claim. It means that what we do here stands for something else, because obviously and indisputably it wasn't the case that 99% of the American population was present in Secaucus Park. And this is where Laclau comes in. Laclau is a radical constructivist theorist of representation. Unfortunately, I won't have time to kind of kind of explain his entire idea of representation. But what is interesting about this figure is that he's trying to make sense of how representative claims are always made by something or someone that is part of a larger whole, and then by making this representative claim, not only says something about this larger whole, but also constitutes how this larger whole, this larger group will understand itself. And a concept that Laclau uses at some places to kind of make sense for this form of representative claim is the idea of the synecdoche, which is a figure of speech, where unlike the metaphor, where an element of something stands for something larger of which it is part. The pars pro toto comparison. So some people used to refer to me as Beard, which I guess that was my nickname, which I guess doesn't mean that they kind of reduced my identity to my facial hair. And so we have many of these examples, the wheels as a reference to a car, etc. These are synecdochal representations where a part is kind of given the potential to stand in for a larger whole. Now what's interesting about the slogan, "We are the 99%" as an example, is that it started precisely as such a synecdochal claim, because it originated in a Tumblr log where people would post pictures of themselves with a sheet of paper or like paperboard, in which they explained their individual situation. They explained how they got into deeply precarious personal situations. And they would sign this. There were very different stories. Some people were in debt, some people had been to Iraq and were hurt there. Some people were living in their parents' basements, couldn't find a place to live. Some people had 3 jobs to kind of to sustain their families, etc. But they all ended this with the slogan, "I am the 99%. And later this was turned into the slogan, "We are the 99%. But I think it neatly illustrates how the synecdochal relation takes place. One takes an individual situation, yet at the same time the implication is that even though the situation of other individuals might be completely different, it nevertheless has some explanatory potential to say something about a shared experience that they all have. And in the same way, Occupy Wall Street and its forms of organization were increasingly presented as, let's say, as representations of what a different political institution or a differently instituted society might look like. And of course, gave a presentation of who the group was, who the part of the society was, who was in this way, without a formal mandate, represented by Occupy Wall Street. So both in their discourses and in their practices of occupation, or their reappropriation of space, and in their forms of organizations, their general assemblies, daily meetings in which all participants were free to take part in decision making, or in the later spokes council structure that Occupy set up, so the kind of council system that it eventually tried to create to kind of give durability to itself. You see that there's this synecdochal relation taking place. There is a claim that is being made about what the movement is, what it stands for, both socially and politically, and thereby it stands for a larger whole. But what it also does is, in that sense, co-constitute that what it claims to stand for. And again, a slogan like "We are the 99% is a good example of this, because the notion of the 99% as a political notion did not exist before Occupy Wall Street. No one identified with the 99%. Even today, the term itself reappears every now and then, especially in the American context, but at the time it had no meaning at all. Yet it was by making this claim and referring to it that the movement kind of co-constituted the idea that there was some kind of class basis that could refer to itself as a 99%. And so you could also argue that synecdochal representation not only is an elementary part of prefiguration, but that it is also prefigurative in its own right, in that it gives rise to something by assuming the existence of something that actually is not there yet, assuming the existence of a group that will refer to itself as the 99%, assuming the existence of a shared conception of democracy that is only implemented there in practice, but not widespread or established yet. Right. So I'll very briefly do this, because of course, how many years after? 12 years after, 13, 14 years after, 14 years after Occupy Wall Street and the Arab Spring. Of course, I mean, I don't want to ridicule the question raised by Bevins in his book. Of course, it is valid and necessary to ask the question, what lasted eventually? How did these movements, if anything, change anything? The question is, of course, whether the kind of, let's say, top-down perspective that authors like Bevins tend to take on this is the only possible one. And so one of the questions that I end my book with is, if we make sense of prefiguration as a radical form of democracy, then what may this lead to in the long term? What did these experiments lead to? Or how may they have political impact in the long term? And I use two metaphors that are presented but not theorized in depth by both authors that I mostly use in this book, by Arendt and Laclau, namely the metaphor of crystallization and the metaphor of sedimentation. For Arendt, crystallization means the moment when different elements from the past spring together and constitute something new. It's not necessarily a concept that she only uses in favorable contexts or conditions. She also describes, for instance, how totalitarianism crystallizes over time. But she also uses it to kind of describe how experiences from the past may be at some point, or memories from the past may at some point be taken up and combined and lead to something radically new, take a new shape, and then lead to new insights or experiences. Another metaphor that she uses, a more famous one, is that of the pearl diver, the philosopher as a pearl diver who goes to the bottom of the sea to kind of, to find pearls which originate in, organic parts that have sunk to the bottom and that have acquired a radically different shape over time and are brought back to the surface by the pearl diver. On the same sense, she says, mostly a reference to Walter Benjamin. That's what radical theorists and what storytellers do. They retrieve these experiences from the past and bring them to the surface where they acquire a very different form and meaning. Laclau uses the term sedimentation, where he speaks about how elements of discourse may over time sediment and then reestablish the bedding of a river, for instance, may end up being part of an insoluble layer that will eventually will eventually characterize the surface in a radically new landscape. And so he argues how certain elements of a discourse can sediment and in a different form end up acquiring an important role in the establishment of what he calls new chains of equivalence, so new discourses that kind of combine different insights or principles or ideas into a new form. I don't have time to kind of to elaborate on this much, but at the very least, I think we could use these kind of concepts to understand how protest movements, even if they've disappeared, even if the squares have been abandoned, the activists have been arrested, or even worse, these kind of movements do retain some of their potential because their story is still told and their experiences are still shared and may give rise to very new ideas and experiences or similar ones in the future. And I think this is indeed where a comparison with, for instance, the encampments that we've seen on many campuses may be valid, because you could argue that it's some kind of some kind of crystallization of previous experiences by these prefigurative movements. I'll leave it to that.